This case takes us to the picturesque city of Bend, located on Oregon's Deschutes River. Bend was home to 23-year-old Kaylee and Sawyer, who lived with her boyfriend of a couple of years, Cameron. Kaylee worked as a dental assistant and was also busy studying at Central Oregon Community College. She was artistic, with interests in photography, drawing, and writing poetry. She was also athletic, enjoying snowboarding, golfing, fishing, and wakeboarding. With so many outdoor activities and stunning sights to capture in Bend, it was an ideal place for Kaylee to live. Her parents divorced and remarried when she was young, but she maintained close bonds with both of them and her stepparents. She also had a strong relationship with her 4 brothers. Friends and family described her as one of the happiest people they knew. She was generous, well-liked, always smiling, entertaining, and often out socializing. Her mother said everyone was a friend to Kaylee, even if they were strangers. On the evening of July 23, 2016, Kaylee planned to celebrate a friend's bachelorette party. She got ready and left to meet everyone in downtown Bend, near her college campus. After parking her car at a friend's house, they all headed out for the evening. Over the next few hours, Kaylee and her friends visited various bars. Everyone was in high spirits. The drinks were flowing. People were dancing, singing, playing games, and enjoying the celebrations. At one point, Kaylee danced with a man at the bar. One of Cameron's friends, who happened to be there, saw her and texted Cameron to tell him. Just after midnight, now July 24th, the night out was winding down. Everyone had a lot to drink, and Kaylee called Cameron for a ride home. On his way to get her, Kaylee texted Cameron's friend to apologize for dancing with the other man and for how it might have appeared. Shortly after, Cameron arrived and picked Kaylee up. An argument started immediately and continued the entire drive home. They parked up outside of their apartment complex, and Cameron said he stormed out of the car as the argument got more heated. Kaylee stayed inside, crying and saying she needed some space to calm down. 10 minutes later, Cameron went back outside to try and coax her in. It was too late to be arguing, and if they just went to sleep, everything would be fine the next day. But as he approached the vehicle, he realized the passenger door was wide open and she was no longer inside. In fact, Kaylee Sawyer was nowhere to be seen. Cameron started searching and sent Kaylee several texts. "Where are you? Kaylee, please just come home to be with me. I don't want to play this game. I'll start searching, but please help me out." Kaylee replied, saying, "My phone's about to die." Cameron said, "Please don't do this to me. I apologize for being upset when I picked you up. I just drove up and down College Way really slow. I didn't see you and I don't know where else to go. Just come back." Kaylee said, "Are you kidding? Because that's bullshit. Goodbye." She then turned her phone off and stopped responding. Cameron went to a friend's house hoping she had walked there, but she hadn't. He drove up and down the streets looking for her, but to no avail. Kaylee's mother, Julie, and her friends were also trying to get hold of her, but Kaylee wasn't responding to any of them either. Everybody was still holding out hope that she had turned up at someone else's house to call off, but it was seeming less and less likely the more time that passed. And soon the police were called. Kaylee's name began circulating on social media and the word was spreading that she was missing, culminating in hundreds of volunteers coming out to look for her. Cameron was interviewed right away, but detectives had no reason to be concerned about him or anything he said, and he was very quickly ruled out. The friends she had been out with were also questioned, but they couldn't help either. Their attention then turned to the man she was seen dancing with at the bar, and they hoped this might give them a lead. But he was just as shocked that she was missing. He had danced with her for all of a few minutes before she had rejoined her group and then left, and he hadn't seen her again after that. Everybody was definitely concerned, but Kaylee's mother, Julie, was far more than that. She said the second she heard her daughter was missing and not replying to anyone, she felt a shift in her whole body, and something was telling her that Kaylee was no longer alive. Officers started trying to find the location of her phone. Her phone was pinging all over the city of Bend, but sadly, this was confirmed to be an old iPhone that was still registered under Kaylee's Apple ID. It was now Monday morning and Kaylee hadn't shown up to her shift at the dental clinic. Police knew they had to pick up the pace, and Kaylee entered law enforcement databases as an endangered missing person. As they approached the 24-hour mark, a new police officer called Isabel would report something to her colleagues that would blow the case wide open. She told them that her husband had been acting very strangely in the last couple of days and had said some incredibly concerning things to her. Her husband was 31-year-old Edwin Lara, and Isabel said his odd behavior had been apparent since he came home very late on Sunday after his shift had finished. He often worked long and late hours as a college campus security guard. The couple had been having problems for a long time, so Isabel didn't push him for answers and just assumed he was being off with her. A few hours later, on what was now Sunday morning, Edwin and Isabel attended church together where Edwin was in the church band. And after this, they went to go and watch a film. But Edwin's weird behavior carried on into the next morning. Edwin also told Isabel that some of Kaylee's things were hidden in the shed. And after this, he fled the house armed with Isabel's gun. Officers went straight to the home where they found exactly what Isabel said they would. Kaylee's person ID, her shoes, a blood-stained rock, and a clump of what looked like it could be Kaylee's hair. What they found pointed to far more than accidentally hitting her with his car and panicking. Everything was pointing towards this being a violent homicide. By this point, however, Edwin was already on the run on what would become an interstate crime spree. After leaving his car at his parents' house, he spotted a 19-year-old called Andrea sitting in her car in a parking lot. She had just clocked off of a 12-hour shift and was about to head home when Edwin opened the passenger side door, pointed a gun at her, and demanded she start driving. As she drove, he showed her pictures of him in his camper security uniform and spoke to her about the news reports talking about Kaylee. After 3 hours on the road, Edmund wanted to stop at a motel for the night. As he checked in, he made Andrea pretend to be his girlfriend. Once inside the room, he handcuffed her to the bathroom door while he showered. He then ordered her to take a shower in front of him. Andrea was fighting against him every step of the way and, point blank, refused. After this, he handcuffed her to the bed and told her to take sleeping pills. In this very moment, the alarm on her phone went off, and, thinking on her feet, Andrea lied, telling Edwin she had an STD. And the alarm was to remind her to take her medication. She hoped that this would stop him from sexually assaulting her. Unfortunately, her plan worked. Edwin, who was becoming more paranoid by the minute, then decided to leave the motel at 1:30 in the morning. The pair carried on driving until 5 a.m. before stopping at another motel. He walked over to a 73-year-old man near his vehicle and tried to take it before shooting him in the stomach. He didn't get the car. Unfortunately, the man survived. Edwin then fled with Andrea on foot to a nearby gas station, where he carjacked a 76-year-old woman. The woman and her 2 young grandsons were inside the car. He forced one of the teens to drive the car at gunpoint before letting them go and carrying on with the vehicle. And thankfully, the family were unharmed. Edwin ordered Andrea to start driving to California where he had family. During the drive, Edwin used Andrea's phone to record a video of himself. He made her post it to Facebook, titling it "Murderer on the Loose." Edwin called his family to tell them what was going on. And at 6:40 a.m., he called 911 telling them who he was and what he was wanted for. A California Highway Patrol officer saw the car speeding on the interstate and tried to pull it over. The chase reached more than 100 miles per hour before Edwin was eventually pulled over. Before he was arrested, he recorded himself saying, I know this is being recorded. And I just want to say to the family of Kaylee that, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did. And in time, I will tell them where the body is. He then handed the phone over to Andrea and the police placed him in handcuffs. 19-year-old Andrea was also arrested, but when they realized that she too was another innocent victim, she was released. When Edwin was taken into custody, he told the officers the same story he had told Isabel, that he had accidentally hit her with his car, but said that he had then strangled her when she wouldn't stop screaming, something which everybody agreed made no sense at all. After this, the detective told him that it was for the best that he come clean, as he would only have to answer to God and repent his sins. Everyone who knew Edwin said he was devout in his religion and that it was one of the most important things to him. So the detective decided to use this knowledge to hopefully get a confession. Edwin finally started to tell the truth. Kaylee had left Cameron's car and walked out into the night. And when Edwin saw her, he started following her in his patrol car. The conversation between the pair, if there indeed was any conversation at all, remains unknown. But somehow, Kaylee ended up in the back of the car and Edwin started driving. Police and Kaylee's family believed that Edwin had offered her a lift, and she had accepted under the assumption that she would be safe with a security guard in the patrol car. Students leaving clubs or bars often received rides home from the campus security, so this would likely not have been unusual or alarming. But as soon as Kaylee got in, she was trapped. The doors wouldn't open from the inside, and she would have been completely helpless. It wasn't long before Edwin started demanding that she have sex with him, and when she refused, he strangled her until she was unconscious. She was then driven several miles out where he strangled her again and smashed a rock against her head. He then raped her. Kaylee was still alive and Edwin grabbed another rock and hit her in the head and left her body there. It is unknown whether she was still alive at this point, which is a truly horrendous thing to contemplate. After this, he drove back to the college campus where he changed cars, and drove back later in an attempt to conceal her body. After he told them everything, officers went to locate the first car that Edwin had been driving when he went on the run, and inside were some handwritten notes, one of which read, "The place I killed her is on the B12 lot. Run her over on College Way," and another which said, "This note is to say that I am sorry for taking her life." It was after this that near a canyon off of Highway 126, the body of Kaylee and Sawyer was finally found. Despite his confession, Edwin Lara pleaded not guilty, and the prosecution announced that they would be seeking the death penalty. Edwin's lawyers argued that his rights had been violated in the interview room, as he wasn't given the option to make any phone calls whilst being held in custody. To everybody's dismay, during a pretrial hearing, a judge actually threw out his lengthy and detailed confession and said that it could not be used as evidence. The prosecution were then left hoping that the forensic evidence would give them enough, but it was undoubtedly a huge blow to their case. Edwin's attorney called his crime spree an enigma and said it could only be explained by his client's genetic degenerative cognitive brain disability. The prosecution said there was no doubt he was a potential serial killer and psychopath. In January 2018, in order to avoid the death penalty, Edwin changed his plea to guilty of aggravated murder and robbery. Despite the evidence they had in Kaylee's case, the charges of sexual assault did not stick. Although Edwin had pleaded guilty, he did not plead guilty to sexual assault. The county district attorney spoke with Kaylee's family and told them that their main goal as prosecutors was to put Edwin away for life, and pushing for a sexual assault conviction as well might complicate the trial and jeopardize the chances of getting a life sentence for murder. Her family begrudgingly agreed. And with this, Edwin Lara was given a life sentence without parole for the murder of Kale and Sawyer. He later received a second life sentence for the kidnap of Andrea. The judge credited Andrea for her extreme courage and bravery, and thanked Kaylee's father and stepmother for one of the most difficult letters he'd ever had to read in his career. He told Kaylee's family he was deeply sorry and said, "I wish I could change things. I can't." Edwin's wife, Isabel, filed for divorce and resigned from her position as a police officer, feeling she couldn't carry on with it, given what it was her ex-husband had done. In her resignation letter, she said, "This decision has not been easy, but I have decided that it will be in the best interests for my career advancement and further development." Kaylee's family filed a lawsuit against the college for failing to do an adequate background check on Edwin and for not acting upon behaviors that gave many people cause for concern. One female officer actually refused to ride in the same car as him and reported him because he scared her so much. The lawsuit also included evidence that the campus safety vehicles very closely resembled police patrol cars, and Central Oregon community officers were given uniforms that were also similar to the Bend police. Community officers were armed with pepper spray, ballistic vests, body cameras, and handcuffs, and drove vehicles with cages inside. And the lawsuit said, this simply should not be allowed, as it allowed people to abuse their position. Kaylee's family finally reached a $2 million settlement with Central Oregon Community College. In 2022, More tragedy came for the Sawyer family when Julie's storage unit was broken into by two people on a drug-fueled crime spree. Over 12 months, John Vieira and Emily Pickett stole from many people, including Julie and her husband, taking $30,000 worth of their belongings, including some of Kaylee's ashes, which Julie had put into a little necklace. John Vieira pleaded guilty to 16 property crimes and was given a 40-month sentence, while Emily was sentenced to 10 days in prison. John admitted to throwing the necklace containing Kaylee's ashes into a bin, and tragically, it has never been recovered. Kaylee's legacy also stays strong through Kaylee's Law, which was passed in 2019. Kaylee's Law requires campus security and their vehicles to be clearly distinguishable from actual law enforcement. The vehicles cannot have rooftop lights or a divider, known as a cage, between the front and back seats. They must have a GPS and an interior video camera that records whenever someone gets inside. Campus officers are also now prohibited from making vehicle stops or stopping and frisking individuals. National background checks and psychological testing would also be required before a security officer is hired. Her family also started KK Readers, KK being Kaylee's nickname. KK Readers honors Kaylee by donating Dr. Seuss books, specifically, the places you'll go to children in Head Start preschool classes all over Central Oregon. It was her favorite book as a child and inspired her to write stories and poetry as she got older. The murder of Kaylee devastated so many, and the painful aftermath prompted some much-needed changes in the law. Julie said of her daughter, "The moment I held her, I understood what love at first sight meant and that it is real. She will continue to live on in all the memories that are shared. She had an amazing 23 years, and I want that to be remembered." Discover the chilling world of secret crime mysteries, where we delve into the most perplexing cold cases and unsolved crimes. Join us as we unravel hidden clues and explore haunting mysteries. Subscribe now and be part of the journey to bring these cases to light. In the early hours of February 3, 2003, a personal driver called 911, reporting that he thought his employer had shot someone. Police arrived where the driver was waiting in less than 3 minutes. 45 minutes later, they reached the Pyrenees Castle in Alhambra, California, a mansion owned by renowned record producer Phil Spector. Inside, they found a woman seated in a chair in the foyer, her legs extended in front of her. The woman had been shot once in the mouth and was later identified as 40-year-old Lana Clarkson. Lana was a film actress who had recently been trying to make a comeback in mainstream Hollywood. She had appeared on television and in several films, her most notable role being in Barbarian Queen and its sequel. In 2001, Lana had invested heavily in creating a one-woman show to showcase her range, portraying various characters in different styles. She hoped this would help her break out of the typecasting she'd faced for years. While Lana had always wanted to explore her comedic talents and prove she could do more than play the blonde in a bikini, an accident interrupted her plans. She broke both wrists slipping on a rug while wearing heels, putting her career on hold. By 2003, she had recovered and taken a hostess job at the House of Blues to make ends meet, hoping that working there might lead to her being discovered. And who was Phil Spector? Born on December 26, 1939, he was a record producer who started his career in 1958 as a founding member of the band, the Teddy Bears, where he wrote and performed the hit, "To Know Him Is to Love Him." However, despite its early success, the band was quickly disbanded. In 1960s, Spector co-founded Phil's Records. By 1962, he was the sole owner of the record label at 21 years old, making him, at the time, the youngest label owner. However, the label was defunct by 1969. Over the years, he worked with numerous singers and groups, with so many songs becoming hits like You've Lost That Loving Feeling by the Righteous Brothers, and he worked with Ike and Tina Turner as well as the Ronettes. He would go on to marry the lead singer of the Ronettes, Ronnie Bennett, in 1968. Shortly after getting married and having some limited success working with Tina Turner, Spector became more of a recluse. He was always known to be a bit odd and to think very highly of himself. After getting married, Ronnie and Phil Spector adopted Dante Philip Spector in 1969. One Christmas, Phil surprised Ronnie with a Christmas present by adopting twins, Louis Philip Spector and Gary Philip Spector. In a 2003 interview, Dante and Gary Spector reported being sexually and psychologically abused by their father. Quote, "For years, we were just caged animals to be let out for Dad's amusement." Dante Spector went on to say, "We were locked in our separate rooms by our governess, let out for breakfast, then taken to school by guards. His adopted children have been very private with their personal life." Ronnie and Spector's marriage was said to have significant strains. He was reported to be very controlling. Spector is said to have made Ronnie drive with a blow-up doll in the passenger seat when she wanted to leave the house. He kept her isolated in their home. She never performed on stage while they were married. With the help of her mother, she was able to flee the house. She was allegedly so scared she left without even putting her shoes on. Once free, she was able to file for divorce, which was finalized in 1974, and she gave up custody of the children and the rights to her songs. In 1970, Phil Spector produced the Beatles' Let It Be album, which would be the last album from the band. He also produced John Lennon's hit Imagine. By the mid-1970s, Phil Spector had produced 18 top 10 singles by various artists. He was credited as the man behind the, quote, wall of sound. He was regarded as one of the great men in music. In the 1980s, Spector began dating Janice and Ella. And in 1982, they welcomed twins, Nicole Spector and Philip Spector Jr. Philip Jr. died of leukemia in 1991. For most of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, Spector remained inactive in the music industry. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a non-performer in 1989, reported to have been drunk or under the influence while giving a speech, and was taken off stage by his bodyguards. By 2003, he was known to not give interviews and to be very reclusive. He'd reconnected with a friend from high school at a 2002 reunion. Her name was Romy Davis. They had started having dinners together often, and on February 2nd, they had dinner at the grill. On this night, Phil was drinking, which he'd not done in the 5 months that they'd been getting together. This was concerning as Spector took medication that did not mix well with alcohol. Romy Davis said, quote, "He was not his usual self. He was not interested in what I had to say. In all the time I went out with him, he was a great fun to be with. This weekend, the behavior was totally different. He would take Romy home and ask the waitress from the grill to join him for a drink at Trader Vic's. There, he would continue to drink. They moved on to Don Tanner's and finally the House of Blues, where he would meet Lana Clarkson after the waitress he'd been with previously had gone home. Outside the House of Blues, he would convince Lana Clarkson to come back to his home. When she got into his car, that was when the driver drove them to his mansion. A short time later, at around 5 a.m., the driver heard a noise. He got out to investigate, going to the door of the home, finding Spector holding a gun. It was then that he noticed the woman behind Spector. This was when the driver got in the car, drove down the street, and called 911. Spector was arrested on the morning of February 3rd. He reported that the police had been very forceful with him, and Spector would later say the woman had actually taken her own life in an accident. Police would look into every possibility, but with how the body had been laid and where the gun was found, they believed only Spector could have been the cause of Lena Clarkson's death. Spector was arrested and charged with the murder and second degree. After Spector's arrest, stories started surfacing of his relationships with women. These discoveries would show Spector to be violent and use guns to threaten women. One woman, Deborah Robitaille, reported that Spector, on more than one occasion, had threatened her with a gun to her head, trying to stop her from leaving his house. At least 4 women came forward willingly to testify at his trial that he had threatened them with a gun. It looked like Phil Spector had no respect for women and hated them. Spector would go to trial for the murder of Lana Clarkson in 2007. While he'd been awaiting trial since 2003, he'd been out on a $1 million bond. While he was awaiting trial, he married Raquel Short in 2006, and she would be seen with Spector at every court hearing. The trial was televised, and Spector treated it like a show. He would show up to court with crazy hair, and the biggest headlines at the time would be about Spector wearing wigs to court. After a while, he started having a more normal hairstyle at court, and it would be confirmed later that they were all wigs. His defense would argue that Lana had committed suicide. Philip had been wearing white and he had no blood spatter on his clothes. However, the prosecution would show evidence that Spector had committed the murder and attempted to clean himself up before the police arrived. The blood spatter would not have reached him if he had had the gun in Lena's mouth and was above her. There was some controversy about a fingernail that might have been removed from the scene. It was never found and never entered into evidence. Lana had one chipped fingernail that the prosecution believed had chipped when the gun had fired while Lana attempted to remove the gun from her mouth, but was too weak from her wrist injury. The jury would come back hung, 10 in favor of convicting and 2 in favor of acquitting, and the judge would ultimately call a mistrial. Spector could be seen celebrating with his wife after the mistrial. Spector had a second trial in 2008. This time, it was not televised. The jury would start deliberations on March 26, 2009. And on April 13th, the jury convicted Phil Spector of second-degree murder, and he was taken immediately into custody. On May 29, 2009, he was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. Appeals were made in 2011, 2012, and 2016, but they were all unsuccessful. In December 2020, Phil Spector contracted COVID-19. On January 16th, at the age of 81, Phil Spector died in a hospital. He would have been eligible for parole in 2024. Around 5 p.m. on June 17, 2013, a young man was jogging through an industrial park in North Attleboro, Massachusetts, when something unusual caught his eye. Investigating further, he discovered the body of a young man, later identified as 27-year-old Odin Lloyd. An autopsy revealed that Lloyd had been fatally shot 6 times. By the following day, June 18th, authorities had connected Odin Lloyd to 23-year-old Aaron Hernandez, a local football star. Hernandez was an NFL tight end, drafted by the New England Patriots in the 4th round in 2010. He was engaged to Shayana Jenkins, his partner since 2007. They welcomed a daughter in 2012 and had been living together since 2011. Hernandez had met Odin Lloyd through Shayana, as Lloyd was dating her sister, Shania Jenkins. The two were reported to have become fast friends. Police would later find surveillance footage of Odin Lloyd getting into a car with Hernandez on the morning of June 17th, with 2 other men later identified as Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace. Phone records would show that Hernandez had contacted Wallace the day before the shooting, asking him to come to his house. Police looked into the rental car that had been seen on security camera footage, and they found the vehicle belonged to a local enterprise rental company. They located the vehicle and dusted it for prints and checked for additional evidence. After this, Aaron Hernandez was served with a search warrant for his home, and when asked to relinquish his cell phone, he gave them a broken phone. Police also questioned why Hernandez had his house cleaners come on June 17th, the day Odin's body was discovered, and not the normal cleaning day. DNA found at the scene connected Hernandez to the crime scene. A wad of bubble gum was found on one of the shell casings found at the scene. The prosecution was gathering a substantial amount of evidence, all of which pointed to Aaron Hernandez. Hernandez was arrested on June 26, 2013, and charged with first-degree murder. The New England Patriots released him that day from his contract. The New England Patriots would also do an unheard-of jersey exchange in July 2013, offering people the opportunity to exchange their Hernandez jerseys for something else, and 100 showed up to do so. Police believe that Aaron Hernandez and his friends picked Odin Lloyd up early on June 17th to hang out, as they often did. However, Hernandez had other plans. They drove him out to the industrial park, had Lloyd get out of the vehicle before they shot him 6 times, then spat his gum on the ground before driving back to his house, leaving Lloyd there. And a lot of what happened that day is still unknown, as witnesses and Hernandez have not talked about the actual events. The case would move quickly after the arrest of Ortiz and Wallace on June 27, 2013. Initially, they were charged as accessories to murder. However, later they were charged with first-degree murder as well. Walls would go to trial and be acquitted for murder, but convicted of being an accessory after the fact. He was sentenced to 4.5 years to 7 years in prison. Ortiz would change his plea to guilty and be convicted of accessory after the fact. He was also sentenced to 4.5 to 7 years. Next would be Tanya Singleton, a cousin of Hernandez. They connected her to the crimes via a car that may have been involved in another incident from 2012. Singleton also refused to testify against Hernandez. She was fighting cancer then. She would be indicted on charges of criminal contempt and conspiracy to commit accessory after the fact. She would plead guilty to criminal conduct and be put on probation, having to wear an ankle monitor. It had been reported that she died of cancer in 2015. Hernandez would plead not guilty. His trial would start on January 9, 2015. While awaiting trial, evidence would come up of Hernandez's involvement in a double homicide in Boston. Hernandez would be indicted on the double homicide from Boston in 2014 and would also plead not guilty. In the Odin Lloyd case, he would be found guilty of first-degree murder on April 15, 2015. In Massachusetts, the only sentence for first-degree murder is life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was incarcerated in the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center. However, this was not the end of Aaron Hernandez's legal problems. He would be indicted in a shooting from 2013 of a man named Alexander Bradley, who was a friend of Hernandez. It's believed that he shot him because he was involved with Hernandez in the 2012 double homicide in Boston. Alexander Bradley had been shot in the face, losing an eye, but survived the attack. On April 14, 2017, Hernandez was found not guilty of the double murder. But 5 days later, Aaron Hernandez was found dead hanging in his cell. He used a bedsheet to commit suicide. At the time, prison officials did not consider him a suicide risk, and he'd not been put on round-the-clock watch. After his death, they did an autopsy, and they would find that Hernandez had a severe case, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, also known as CTE, which is a brain condition thought to be linked to repeated head injuries and blows to the head. It slowly gets worse over time and leads to dementia, but the right help with treatment and support can manage the symptoms. It is believed that this may have attributed to his declining mental health and his suicide. After his death, his lawyers filed a motion to vacate his conviction, citing abatement ab initio. Under Massachusetts law, this principle asserts that when a criminal defendant dies but has not exhausted all legal appeals, the case reverts to a status at the beginning. The conviction is vacated. The defendant is rendered innocent. Hernandez had been in the process of appealing the O'Delloy conviction. The motion was initially granted in May 2017, however. The conviction was later reinstated in 2019 by the Supreme Court, stating that ab initio is outdated. After his death, reports would come out that Hernandez had been secretly gay and had come out to his mother and girlfriend while in jail. An old high school classmate would confirm that they had a relationship during high school. Hernandez was deeply ashamed of his attraction to men. He had been sexually abused as a child by a babysitter for years, and while on prison calls, he often went on homophobic rants. His self-hatred got worse with the decline of his mental health. After his incarceration, he also became deeply religious. It was an aspect of his life that he struggled with: the childhood trauma, his sexuality, and his religious beliefs. There have been some speculation on whether Odin Lloyd had found out either about the double homicide or Hernandez hiding his sexuality, and that may have been the motive for the murder. However, it is also revealed that Hernandez abused illicit substances, especially during the off-season, and was prone to bouts of paranoia, mood swings, and violent agitation. We will likely never know what happened that prompted the murder of Odin Lloyd. Just after midnight on November 16, 1999, in Charlotte, North Carolina, a woman named Cherika Adams called 911 to report that she'd been shot at. During the call, she informed the dispatcher that she was 8 months pregnant. She also revealed that the father of her child was in a car in front of her, had slowed down, and then another car pulled up beside her and fired into her vehicle. Evidence later showed that she'd been shot 4 times at close range through the driver's side window. Cherika named the father of her unborn child as Ray Caruth. Caruth, a former NFL wide receiver, was a first-round pick in the 1997 draft by the Carolina Panthers. Wearing the number 89, he excelled in his rookie year, earning a spot on the NFL's all-rookie team. However, an injury took him out for the rest of the 1998 season after he broke his foot in the opening game. He was still actively playing for the Panthers in 1999. Cherika Adams, 24, was a realtor who had previously worked as an exotic dancer until her pregnancy. She had met Ray Carruth at the club where she worked, and they began a casual relationship. They hadn't gone on an official date before she became pregnant, and this night was one of their first dates. Sharika had always wanted to be a mother, and this was her first child. During the 911 call, Sharika said that Ray Carruth had driven away after the shooting, leaving her alone. It took almost 10 minutes for the dispatchers and medic to find Sharika. After being rushed to the hospital, Sharika went to a coma. The medical staff performed an emergency C-section. The child had been born without oxygen for 70 minutes. The child, a boy, survived, but he was born with cerebral palsy due to complications surrounding his birth. Authorities would quickly tie Ray Carruth to the shooting. Through the investigation into Carruth, they would also get the names of some of the accomplices, 44-year-old Van Brett Watkins and 24-year-old Michael Kennedy. Carruth and Watkins would be arrested Thursday, November 25, 1999, and charged with conspiracy, commit murder in the first degree, attempted murder, and shooting into an occupied vehicle. Kennedy would be arrested the next day and charged the same. All three men would be held on bail of $1,500,000, but the judge would return at the end of the day and change Carruth's bail to $3 million, $1 million for each charge. A fourth man would be charged, Stanley Abraham, who was 19 years old. Carruth posted bail was released on December 7th. On December 14, 1999, after almost a month in a coma and having never met her son, Trika Adams, passed away. All men were charged with first-degree murder, which would make all these men eligible for the death penalty. Carruth failed to appear for the resentencing hearing, and the FBI became involved as Carruth was now on the run. They would find him a few days later after a tip came in that he'd been seen in a motel in Wildersville, Tennessee. It was reported that Carruth was there with a woman. When agents searched the motel room, they didn't find Carruth. Agents searched the cars and vehicles in the parking lot and found Carruth in the trunk of a Toyota registered to the woman he was reported to have been with. The FDA agents would report that Carruth was very cooperative with authorities once discovered. After his capture, Carruth had been held without bail awaiting trial. On December 16th, the Carolina Panthers released Carruth, citing moral clauses in his contract. The next day, the NFL suspended him indefinitely. Carruth was the first active NFL player to be charged with murder, as O.J. Simpson was not active at the time of his charges. Opening statements of the trial started in November 2000. The official charges were murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, shooting into an occupied vehicle, and using an instrument to destroy an unborn child. Both Michael Kennedy and Van Brett Watkins would testify during the trial. Carruth had been friends with Kennedy for a while, and they were known to hang out frequently, both at his apartment and the house that he got after signing with the Panthers. Watkins met Carruth while working at the club. He would eventually hire Watkins as personal security. Stanley Abraham was friends with Kennedy and had been with him the night that Sharika was shot. It is believed that after discovering that Sharika was pregnant, Ray had asked her to abort the baby, as he was already paying $5,000 a month in child support to his high school sweetheart who had gotten pregnant years before. Sharika refused because she had an abortion and didn't want to have another. He then alleged to have asked Watkins to beat her up so that it would abort the baby. He refused because he was a hitman, but he didn't beat up women. They apparently went back and forth for months negotiating until Carruth would agree to pay $3,000 up front and $3,000 after to have Sharika killed, who now was almost 8 months pregnant. Initially, he had asked Watkins to kill her while he was away at training camp so that he would have a solid alibi, but that didn't happen, and it was decided that it would have to be done while Carruth took Sharika out on a date. On November 15th, Carruth would call his friend Kennedy and ask if he could borrow a plane vehicle, something without flash. Kennedy was driving a rental at the time and agreed to trade cars. When Kennedy got to the house, Ray asked if he could get a gun, and he said he knew a friend selling a gun. Abraham was with Kennedy at the time. Kennedy would end up taking Watkins and Abraham to buy a gun. Carruth would take Sharika to a movie on their date, and they drove in separate vehicles towards Carruth's house on the way back from the movie. Carruth would call the car with Kennedy, Watkins, and Abraham. When it was time, Carruth slowed down his vehicle, making Sharika slow down. Kennedy was driving the car with Watkins in the passenger seat. Pulling up to Sharika's car, Watkins would fire 4 shots into the driver window. Ruth then drove away, leaving the scene. Watkins said that he got out to check if she was dead, then returned to the car. Kennedy then drove away, and after that Sharika called 911. For testifying, Van Brett Watkins took a plea deal of second-degree murder to take the death penalty off the table and was sentenced to a minimum of 40 years. He will not be eligible for parole until he's 85 years old. Michael Kennedy didn't have the same plea deal when he testified, but would eventually plead guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 11 years 8 months in prison. He was released in 2011. Abraham would plead to a lesser accessory charge as it was believed he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had no arrest record and was only 19 and spent 90 days in jail in a youth facility before being released on parole. Ray Caruth was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, shooting into an occupied vehicle, and using an instrument to destroy an unborn child. The jury found him not guilty of first-degree murder, stating that he was not the one to pull the trigger, and this saved him from the chance of the death penalty. Members of the jury had gone on to say that if that had been an option, they would have gone for it. He was sentenced to 18 years 11 months. Caruth was released from prison in 2018 and moved to Pennsylvania. His son, now 22 years old, has lived with Sandra Adams, his grandmother, who has now been an advocate against domestic violence since her daughter's death. He recently graduated high school in 2021, a great accomplishment for him. While in prison, Caruth sent a letter to Sandra Adams asking for forgiveness. In an interview before his release, he said he would like to be involved in helping his son financially and to see him if he wanted. There has been no confirmed meeting. Sandra Adams has reported to have forgiven Caruth and even said she was grateful to him for her grandson, saying in a statement, quote, "I'm not going to have anything negative to say about him. I thank him for my grandson. Like I say, you can focus on what you've lost or what you have left. So I didn't lose. I have my grandson. I have my daughter with me in my heart always." In 1987, 25-year-old Wendy Nell was living in Tunbridge Wells, Kent. Known for her humor, spontaneity, and generosity, she wasn't into the nightlife scene but loved to travel. Independent and diligent, she managed a Super Snaps shop on Camden Road, where she developed film. Wendy was a kind, approachable manager who put new employees at ease during training. Her previous marriage had ended amicably just before she began working for Super Snaps in early 1985. She transferred to the Camden Road location in early 1987 after moving to a bedsit on Guilford Road. On June 21st, Wendy celebrated her niece's 5th birthday, sharing stories of a recent trip to Austria with her family. She was soon heading to Paris with her boyfriend, Ian, where the couple planned to get engaged. Her first marriage hadn't dimmed her hope for a family and a home. Wendy spent the next evening with Ian at his mother's house, and he later drove her home on his motorcycle, dropping her off around 11 p.m. He didn't stay, as he had to work early the next morning. At her door, they briefly discussed their trip to Paris and kissed goodnight before Wendy went inside. The following day, one of Wendy's co-workers, Deborah, reported to work at the Super Snaps to find that Wendy had not arrived to open the shop. At 9 a.m., she was able to contact another co-worker who gave her Wendy's address. Deborah drove over to Wendy's flat and rang her doorbell several times, but Wendy did not answer the door. Her co-worker then called Wendy's mother, Pamela, to ask if she knew where Wendy was. Pamela, in turn, called the Maidstone and District Bus Company, where both her husband Belle and Wendy's boyfriend Ian worked, just before 11 a.m. after she could not reach her daughter by phone. Ian then drove over to Wendy's home. Like Deborah, he did not get an answer when he rang the doorbell, so he began pounding on the door and calling Wendy's name. When he still received no response from inside, he went around the back of the building, where there was a window in Wendy's room that could not be properly secured. Ian could see Wendy in her bed through the window. He could also see some blood. As Ian climbed into the room through the window, he yelled out for Wendy to wake up. Wendy was still not moving. Ian could not comprehend what had happened. He stroked her hair, pulled down her blanket, picked up her arm, and tried to pull up her eyelids in an effort to wake her up. his brain still not processing the fact that Wendy was dead. Ian climbed back out the window and ran to a nearby fire station for help before sitting down and sobbing. In a 2012 statement, Ian said, "Not a day goes by when I don't feel guilty about her death. If I'd stayed the night, she would be alive today." The day Wendy's body was found, June 23rd, was her father Bill's birthday. Wendy had been raped, beaten, and strangled. Just 5 months after Wendy was killed, another young woman from Tunbridge Wells was murdered. 20-year-old Caroline Pierce lived less than a mile away from Wendy. She also worked on Camden Road as a manager at a popular restaurant called Buster Brown's. Despite the proximity of their homes and the places where they worked, it is believed that the two women did not know each other. They may have seen each other in passing, however, as they both frequently ate lunch at the same cafe. Caroline spent the evening of November 24, 1987 out with friends. A taxi dropped her off outside of her flat in Grosvenor Park shortly before midnight. Authorities do not believe she ever made it inside. Several of her neighbors reported hearing screams shortly after Caroline was dropped off by the taxi. One neighbor reported hearing a woman shout "no" multiple times, while others just heard shrieks. Several of these witnesses looked out their windows to try to see what was going on, but none of them saw the woman who was the source of the screams. Caroline was reported missing by her family the following day after she failed to report to work. She would not be located for 3 weeks. On December 15th, her body was found in an overgrown drainage ditch running through farmland in Romney Marsh, nearly 40 miles away from her home. She was only spotted because the man who found her had been driving a tractor, which put him up high enough to see her body down in the water-filled ditch. Based on the extent of the decomposition her body had undergone, authorities believed she was killed the night she was abducted. Caroline's body was found curled up in the fetal position, wearing only a pair of black tights. Authorities believed the tights had been put back on her body after she was killed, as her underwear was missing. Caroline's handbag was located nearby, but the rest of the clothing she had been wearing the night she was abducted was never found. Like Wendy, Caroline had been raped, beaten, and strangled. Both Caroline and Wendy's keys were missing and never located. Both women had at least one distinctive keychain on their key ring. Reports of a peeping Tom around both victims' homes had been made in the months leading up to the murders and on the days when each woman was killed. A man had been seen looking into windows of residences near Wendy's the night she was killed and in the weeks previous. One of Wendy's neighbors, who lived 2 floors above her, reported seeing the same man looking into the windows of a building across the road up to 3 times a week for over a month. 8 weeks before her death, Caroline Pierce had locks fitted to her windows because she did not feel safe, and she filed a report about a prowler a month later, just weeks before she was killed. She had reported seeing a peeping Tom around her home to a former boyfriend. Based on the similarities between the two women's appearance, living situation, and causes of death, as well as the reports of prowlers nearby, the 2 murders were officially linked by the police. The crimes were dubbed the Bedsit murders in the press in reference to the one-room style of flat both the victims lived in at the time of their deaths. Investigators did have some forensic evidence they could use at the time: a bloody fingerprint found on a shopping bag in Wendy's bed, and a distinctive shoe print that did not match any shoes owned by Wendy or her loved ones left on one of Wendy's blouses. There was also evidence that they did not have the technology to fully use in the investigation quite yet: DNA. Colin Pitchfork, the first individual convicted of murder based on DNA evidence, was arrested in September of 1987 after Wendy's murder and before Caroline's. However, it was still a novel technology in the legal system, and police in Kent did not have access to a large database of DNA samples to compare the DNA from the crime scene to at the time. While DNA was too new of a tool to be as useful as it is today, investigators did understand its value and preserved swabs and other DNA evidence accordingly. The case was featured twice on the BBC program Crime Watch over the years, with numerous tips called in following each episode. Police collected hundreds of DNA swabs from potential suspects, none of which proved to be a match to the DNA from the crime scene, and traveled to Australia and Canada to follow up on leads. Caroline's parents relocated, and they do not speak about their daughter's death publicly, although they were very supportive of the investigation. Wendy's parents spoke to the media about the pain the loss of their daughter had caused and the strain it put on their relationship. They again spoke about their hope to finally catch the killer at a press conference on the 25th anniversary of the murders in 2012. Bill Nell died in 2017 after a battle with liver cancer, heartbroken over the lack of resolution in his daughter's case. His dying wish was for Wendy's killer to finally be found, even though he would not be alive to see the arrest. Investigators did their best to use the preserved DNA from the cases as advances in technology, as well as the law provided them with more opportunities to do so. DNA would be found on swabs taken during Wendy's post-mortem examination, as well as her bedding and one of her towels. The DNA profile was run through the relatively new National Criminal Database in 1999, but no match was found. By 2019, available technology allowed for DNA to be extracted from the degraded semen sample found on Caroline's tights as well, providing authorities with further evidence connecting Caroline and Wendy's murders. However, there was still no match to the profile in the National Criminal Database. This led investigators to attempt to use the database in a slightly different way. The killer they were looking for had never been compelled to submit a DNA sample following an arrest, but perhaps another member of his family had. They instead tried using familial DNA to identify potential relatives of Caroline and Wendy's killer in the database. Out of the 6.5 million DNA profiles in the national database, they were able to identify a few profiles with enough genetic similarity to indicate that they were related to the man responsible for the Betsit murders. These small number of individuals had a large number of relatives, so authorities began narrowing them down based on age and residence in 1987. The most promising profile from the database appeared to be a sibling of the killer, so this family was most closely scrutinized. The individual from the database had a brother named David Fuller, who had been in his early 30s and living in the next major town over from Tunbridge Wells in 1987. His DNA was never entered into the National Criminal Database, but only because his criminal behavior predated it. He first became known to police when he was still in school for stealing bicycles and setting fires, which resulted in property damage. In the 1970s, he committed a string of what the police called creeper burglaries. When police met with 66-year-old Fuller in 2020, he was living in Heathfield, West Sussex with his third wife and their teenage son. He also had adult children from an earlier marriage. He told police during questioning that he had not been very familiar with Tunbridge Wells back in the 80s, and that he had never been to the Super Snaps or the Buster Brown's restaurant there. Fuller's fingerprints were taken as well as a DNA sample. One of his fingerprints was a match to the fingerprint left at Wendy's crime scene. His DNA was a match to the DNA found at both Wendy and Caroline's crime scenes. Unfortunately for Fuller, police were also very quickly able to determine that he had lied to them during questioning. During a search of his home following his arrest, they found numerous pieces of evidence that tied him to Tunbridge Wells and to the murders. Fuller maintained detailed records of his daily life going back decades. In his home were piles of old computer hard drives, old invoices and daily diaries, over 21,000 obsolete digital storage drives, and more than 30,000 printed photographs. Sorting through these records, police found numerous invoices for work Fuller had done as an electrician in Tunbridge Wells, as well as diary entries showing he regularly ate at Buster Brown's, the restaurant where Caroline Pierce had worked as a manager. He was familiar with the street where Wendy had lived because he had lived on it in the 1970s, early 80s prior to her moving there. There were numerous photos of Fuller on rides with a cycling club back in the late 1980s. When investigators contacted other former members of this club, they reported that one of the group's cycling routes had gone through Romney Marsh, where Caroline's body had been found. Police also found a picture of Fuller sunning his back sometime in 1980s. In the photo, the distinctive thread of his Clark's brand of shoes was visible, and the pattern of the thread was matched to the bloody footprint left on Wendy's blouse. Fuller was arrested at his home on December 3, 2020. In light of the DNA evidence during a pretrial review, he did admit that he was the person who killed both Wendy and Caroline, but he pleaded not guilty to murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He went to trial in the beginning of November 2021. However, on November 4th, the fourth day of his trial at Maidstone Crown Court, the now 67-year-old Fuller changed his plea to guilty. Following Fuller's change of plea, A statement from the Nell family was read outside the courthouse. Although the guilty plea won't change anything deep down, as the pain and loss will always be there, it's good to know he will not be in a position to hurt or cause any more pain, not just for our family, but for Caroline's family and friends who have been on this same journey with us and all the other families his life has affected. We feel a deep sadness for you all, the statement said in part. Unfortunately, as the Nell family's statement alluded to, the resolution of the 2 murder cases opened up a much larger investigation of a different, but still horrifying nature. Most of the storage devices and records Fuller had spent the previous decades hoarding were in plain view when police searched his home. However, police also found a container holding 4 hard drives attached to the back of a cabinet. The cabinet had been pushed against a wall inside of a cupboard so that the container and the hard drives were hidden from view. According to prosecutor Duncan Atkinson, when these hard drives were examined, they were found to contain a library of unimaginable sexual depravity. The 4 hard drives contained 5 terabytes of data storage. They contain millions of images and videos taken by Fuller as he raped and sexually abused corpses in hospital morgues. Fuller had worked as a hospital electrician since 1989, starting out at the Kent and Sussex Hospital and working there until it closed in September 2011. He then transferred to the Tunbridge Wells Hospital at Pembrey, where he continued to work until his arrest in December of 2020. As an electrician, he had an all-access swipe card, which allowed him to enter the area of the hospital where autopsies were performed. According to records, he entered the autopsy area thousands of times. The swipe card system was designed to monitor for unusual access to the autopsy area, but the records appear to have never been checked. Fuller would have legitimate reasons for entering the autopsy area, like checking the temperatures of the refrigerators in them, and surveillance footage shows him carrying equipment he would have needed for such tasks around some of the times he is known to have committed his crimes, providing him with a cover story were another staff member to come across him in the autopsy area. Fuller was able to take advantage of shifts work by different employees within the hospital. The 5 staff members in the mortuary normally worked from 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. Fuller's regular shift was from 11 a.m. until 7 p.m., giving him a 3-hour window during which he was in the hospital, but the mortuary staff was not. Porters could bring bodies down at any time of day or night, but the refrigerators in which hospitals stored them could be opened from both ends. The porters would place bodies in the refrigerators using the door from the main receiving area and would then lock the door. Buller would access the bodies from within the autopsy area, where no staff was usually present after 4 p.m. and the doors were not locked. There were CCTV cameras in the main receiving area, but not in the autopsy area itself, in an effort to show respect to the deceased individuals who were being autopsied there. Fuller bypassed the receiving area and its cameras by entering the autopsy area through utility areas. Over 100 women and 3 children, ranging in age from 9 to 100, were seen being abused in the images and videos found on the hard drives hidden in Fuller's home. Authorities were able to identify around 80 of them by the identification tags visible in the available images. Kent police have set up Operation Sandpiper in an effort to try to identify the remaining victims. Relatives who are concerned their loved ones may be one of these unidentified victims can contact Kent police via the website or phone number listed on the screen. The Victim Support Service has provided a £1,500,000 grant to notify and counsel the families of Fuller's victims. According to Detective Superintendent Ivan Beasley, the scale of this offending is unprecedented in the UK. There is nothing we've ever seen like this. The offenses documented in the files on the hard drives occurred between 2008 November of 2020. This leaves a concerning 20-year gap between the murders of Caroline and Wendy and the offenses documented in Fuller's files. During the original investigation into Wendy's murder, it was determined that she had been raped on the point of death or after death, meaning that Fuller may have committed the murders to give him access to bodies rather than to cover up the rapes of living victims. Authorities are investigating the possibility that Fuller was committing offenses against the deceased throughout the years following Caroline and Wendy's murders. One of Fuller's victims was 24-year-old Uzra Kamal, who worked as a researcher for Sky News. She was smart, strong, and dedicated to helping others. When one of Uzra's friends was thrown out of her home by an abusive boyfriend, Uzra's response was to go to the home and throw him out instead. Azra died after falling off of a bridge in July of 2020. She and another passenger had exited the car they were riding in after it caught fire. Azra fell 40 feet through a gap between the two sides of the A21 dual carriageway near Tunbridge in Kent as she was going for help. Azra's body was raped by Fuller 3 times, with the attacks occurring both before and after Azra's mother, Nevris, came to say goodbye to her daughter. So, whilst I'm stroking my daughter's hair, sleeping on her hair, a man had crawled all over her skin, and there's me kissing and cuddling and saying my last goodbyes. And that is quite awful. Quite awful. However, it is not Azra's shame. It is not my shame. Like women who are raped around the world, they have a voice. Azra has a voice. I am speaking out for my daughter, Miss Kamal told Sky News. Miss Kamal has been a vocal advocate for her daughter, calling for increased security measures and the resignation of the chief executive of the NHS Trust in light of the offences that occurred under his watch. She has also raised concerns over the length of sentences offences like those Fuller committed against her daughter receive under current law. During questioning following his arrest for Wendy and Caroline's murders and the discovery of the hard drives, Butler admitted to the necrophilia. He also acknowledged that he had researched some of his victims online using sites like Facebook after he assaulted them. He learned the names of these victims from their identification tags and mortuary logbooks. He logged the names of these victims from their identification tags and mortuary logbooks. He logged their names and information in a notebook as well as organized the images and videos of their assaults into files, sometimes by name, on his computer. In court, Fuller pled guilty to 32 individual counts of sexual penetration of a corpse, as well as a further group charge of sexual penetration of a corpse that represents 27 other victims. He further pled guilty to Section 63 of the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act of 2008, extreme pornography involving a dead body. While Fuller has not yet been sentenced, between the 2 murder charges and numerous necrophilia-related charges, he will certainly receive a lengthy sentence. However, Nevris, Kamal, and others have raised concerns over the sentencing guidelines for sexually abusing corpses. The maximum penalty for penetration of a dead body is 2 years imprisonment, while extreme pornography involving a dead body carries a sentence of 3 years. Ms. Kamal has called for a much clearer law prohibiting necrophilia and an increase in the amount of time in prison the law requires as punishment for it. Shortly after Fuller's guilty pleas, the Health Secretary announced an independent inquiry looking into his offenses and their national implications. It hopes to uncover how such offenses were committed without being noticed by the NHS for so long in areas where future action will be needed. The report will be divided into 2 parts, with an interim report expected in early 2022 and the full report later in the year. Nevris Kamal will continue advocating for her daughter and work to ensure that an offender as prolific as Fuller will never again be allowed to operate without notice. I've tried to protect Azra all my life, and when she was really helpless, lying there, still being raped and abused, she couldn't scream out, couldn't call me, she couldn't call the police. But I will ensure her voice is heard, and that will be my mission, she told Sky News. On Monday, February 2, 1987, Maria Pacheco took her newborn son, Elias Monroy Jr., for a routine checkup at LAUSC Medical Center in Los Angeles. Just 2 weeks old, Elias was born healthy and happy, though his birth had been hard on Maria. Still recovering from a cesarean section, Maria was in significant pain, making it difficult to move around. While waiting in the clinic, a woman in her 30s approached her, introducing herself as a fellow mother. Maria found the woman friendly and genuine as they chatted briefly. When Elias started crying, Maria looked through her diaper bag, realizing she hadn't brought enough bottles. The woman offered to hold Elias while Maria went to find some formula, and Maria agreed. She was gone only a few minutes, but when she returned, both the woman and her son were gone. Initially, it was assumed the woman had simply gone to her appointment, taking Elias with her, but no one matching her description had an appointment or was registered as a patient. Little Elias had been kidnapped. When detectives started investigating the abduction, detectives in Esperia, California reached out with a similar abduction attempt on January 14th. In that case, a woman who had similarities to the description of the LA abductor approached a woman in a post office who was with her 4-month-old son. This woman had started chatting with the mother and had asked to hold the baby, which the mother declined. She left the post office and continued running her errands. Later on in the day, she arrived at a Safeway. She parked and was unbuckling her son from the car seat when she noticed the woman from the post office barreling towards her. The woman was screaming, "I want the baby. I want the baby," and tried to rip the little boy from his mother's arms. And it was then that she noticed that there was a man with the woman this time. The mother kicked at the woman, knocking her back. Then the man tried to take the child from her arms and she kicked him as well, getting him between the legs, and she ran with her child into the grocery store. She was helped by the store employees, but the 2 child abductors ran off. By the time law enforcement arrived, they were long gone. The woman was described as Hispanic, 30 to 35 years old, around 5'7" and a pound 150. Both said that she had a dark complexion, and Maria said that the woman had long brown hair but the ends were frosted blonde. Mother didn't get a good look at the man and there wasn't a description of him. Unfortunately, there are no photographs of Elias, but a new age progression image has been generated to show what he may look like today. Elias is Hispanic with brown hair and brown eyes. At the time of his abduction, he weighed a pound 8 and was 1 foot 9 inches long. He would be 36 years old today, and it is believed he was abducted by a woman to be raised as her own. He may still be in the California area. He may believe he was adopted as a child. Maria put out a plea out to social media saying, quote, "Elias, look for me. Communicate with me. I am your mom and you were my dream come true, but someone took you from me." The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is very hopeful in identifying Elias and reuniting him with his family. Anyone who recognizes Elias from the age progression image with a sketch of the abductor is asked to contact the LAPD at 1-877-ASK-LAPD or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It was on April 5, 1975 when 2-year-old Christopher Bush was left unattended in a vehicle at a grocery store parking lot in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He had been left in the care of a babysitter, 26-year-old Patricia Warwick at the time, and had been with her for 2 weeks prior following a fire that destroyed the Bush home. Christopher's mother, Gwendolyn, was staying with relatives with her 3 other children. Patricia Warwick had offered to look after Christopher while they found a new home that would accommodate all the children again. When Patricia returned to the 1966 maroon Ford station wagon after shopping, she discovered that Christopher wasn't there. All that was left was the hat that he'd been wearing. She searched the surrounding area, but found no sign of the toddler, finally calling the police an hour later. Precious time had been lost, and the investigation turned up little information. Over 100 officers searched for days, but nothing came up. Patricia swore that she had left the car doors locked. There was no sign of a break-in. However, someone could have easily convinced Christopher to unlock the door. Car seats weren't mandatory in the US until 1986, so it's likely that he was just sitting in the back seat. Alternatively, she might have forgotten to check all the doors of the car. Either way, someone got in. Patricia claimed that she'd only been in the store for 10 minutes before coming back to the vehicle, so the window for the abduction was relatively short. Christopher Bush is described at the time of his abduction as a black male, 2 foot 10 a pound 40. He was wearing a denim jacket with a white fur trimmed collar and a light blue corduroy pants. He was born in 1973 and may have been adopted out in 1975. The case remains unsolved and there's been little movement in the case since 1975, though there are hopes that he will be found and reunited with his family. Christopher would have been 50 years old today and may have grown up in the Pennsylvania area. It was on April 27, 1974, when 5-year-old Cynthia Lynn Sumter was playing outside on the front lawn of the apartment building she lived in with her mother in San Jose, California. Cynthia's mother, Linda, left around noon to pick up sandwiches for lunch, but while she was gone, she asked a neighbor to watch her daughter. When she returned about an hour later, Cynthia hadn't come in for lunch yet. She looked outside, but couldn't see her out front. For 30 minutes, she searched by herself, but opted to call the police, who gathered a 50-person search party to look for the little girl. Dozens of leads came in, but it appeared that the girl had vanished without a trace. One lead from a witness stated that they saw a little girl matching Cynthia's description in a blue car driven by a young man with blonde hair and a mustache. However, this sighting was never confirmed by a secondary witness, so it's hard to know if this was a credible sighting. Days after her disappearance, a neighbor reached out to Linda and threatened that she needed to drop the criminal charge against his brother to see Cynthia again, along with a $1,000 cash. 5 weeks before the abduction, Cynthia had been molested by a boy who lived next door. Linda had pressed criminal charges. It was determined that the boys didn't have Cynthia and were charged with attempted extortion. Cynthia's parents had divorced a year earlier, and in the early days of the investigation, both accused the other of kidnapping the child. Both were investigated and asked to take polygraph tests, which they both passed. They were ultimately ruled out as suspects. Another suspect was Antonio Madrid, a neighbor who lived 100 yards from the apartment building. Madrid committed suicide 2 days after the abduction. Law enforcement later found a shirt with blood on it and blonde hairs in his vehicle. It is unclear if genetic testing had been done on those items. Convicted killer Eugene Joseph Wesley was also investigated about Cynthia's disappearance. While connected to a polygraph machine, it showed deception, leading detectives to believe he knew more than he was saying. However, law enforcement stopped investigating him when he died in prison. At the time of her disappearance, Cynthia is wearing a red and white striped tank top with a blue star on the front and purple pants. She was barefoot. She is described as white with blonde hair and blue eyes. She has a cowl look on the right side of her hairline and a mole on the left side of her neck and shin. Her nickname was Cindy, and she often went by both Cindy or Cynthia. Linda believes Cynthia is still alive. A body was never found, nor any evidence that would point to the contrary. In a statement to the media, she said, quote, "I pray every day that God will bring her back into my life sometime here on this earth, not just in heaven, that I can hold her one more time and tell her how much I loved her." The San Jose Police Department is hopeful in solving the cold case and is asking anyone with information to come forward, as without it, the case will likely go unsolved. In a statement to the media, they said, quote, "Even after this many years, someone out there has information that can be helpful to the San Jose Police. We won't close this case until she is physically found." It was on September 20th, 1991 on Staten Island, New York, when the body of a woman was discovered in a patch of weeds along a dirt road. The woman had been handcuffed, severely beaten with a hammer, and strangled to death. Her body was then set ablaze. The murder weapon was found under her body with the name Lloyd L. carved into the handle. The woman remained unidentified for 3 decades, known for all those years as Jane Doe with a scorpion tattoo. The cold case was opened in 2023 when familial DNA gave her name back as Christine Belusco. Christine was 30 years old at the time of her murder. She'd been a missing person since September 13th, 1991, when she was last seen by family members. Christine had recently learned that she was adopted and had a falling out with her parents, who hadn't told her about the adoption until she was an adult. It had been a shock to Christine, and she told her family she was moving to Florida. That was the last she had been seen. Her family had no idea she'd been dead all these years. Her brother was the one to receive the notice that Christine had been identified as a Jane Doe. He asked if they had also found Krista. It was only then that law enforcement learned that Christine had a child who'd been with her at the last time she'd been seen. Her daughter had only been 2 at the time. Krista Nicole Belusco was last seen with her mother at the Mount Erie Lodge in Mount Panaco, Pennsylvania. Her family never knew who her father was. Law enforcement believe that finding Krista's killer will lead to finding Krista. They believe that Christine was killed by someone she knew and are hoping that finding the identity of Krista's father will point them in the right direction. Krista Nicole will be 33 years old today. Her birthday was August 1st, 1989. She is described as Caucasian with brown hair and brown eyes. If you recognize Krista Nicole or know anything about the murder of Christine Belusco, call the Richmond County District Attorney's Office at 718-556-7085. Claire Bernal, 22, was originally from Groombridge in Kent. She attended St. Gregory's Catholic Comprehensive School in Tunbridge Wells, then moved on to West Kent College, where she earned a BTEC National Diploma. Known for her shyness, gentleness, and thoughtfulness, Claire was always considerate of others and never spoke poorly of anyone. She pursued various makeup and beauty courses, including theater makeup at Shepperton Studios. Her dedication paid off when she landed her dream job as a beauty consultant at Harvey Nichols in Knightsbridge. Harvey Nichols is one of London's most prestigious luxury department stores, with the Knightsbridge location as its flagship. To prepare for her interview, Claire meticulously wrote pages of notes, determined to make a strong impression, and her efforts paid off. Since childhood, Claire had a passion for skincare and makeup, and she felt incredibly proud to work for such an iconic store. Popular with her colleagues, Claire was described as well-spoken, warm, and quietly charismatic. She moved to Dulwich in southeast London, sharing a flat with 2 co-workers. Claire thrived in London, embracing the excitement of the bustling city and seizing every opportunity. It was while working at Harvey Nichols that she met 30-year-old Michael Pesh, one of the store's security guards. The pair began chatting, and he soon asked her if she wanted to go on a date with him in January 2005. Michael Pesh was a dual citizen of both the Czech Republic and Slovakia. He had previously been a soldier in Slovakia, but would be prosecuted for desertion. After working as a security guard at the United States Embassy in Bratislava, he moved to the United Kingdom. Shortly after arriving, he began working as a security guard for Harvey Nichols. They went on a few dates over the course of about 3 weeks. Claire's mother Tricia would later say he was quite a bit older than Claire, and he was going through a divorce. It wasn't an ideal situation that any mom would want for their young daughter. During the time they dated, I never got the sense she had fallen in love with Michael. She was very flattered by his attention. He showered her with affection and very quickly told her he loved her. Claire's cousin, Christian, said alarm bells went off when he told her that he loved her after a very short time. It was no more than 3 dates they had been on. The red flag just started waving. After their first date, Claire called her mother and told her she felt very uncomfortable. She said he wanted to be with her all the time and didn't like her seeing her friends. She said he didn't like her going home and that she was feeling suffocated, adding, "It's all happening much too quickly. Things only started to get worse." When Michael returned from a trip to Slovakia, he demanded that Claire be there to meet him when he got into the airport, as he didn't want to have to take his suitcase across London. He then said he wanted to stay at Claire's flat, a prospect that made her extremely uneasy, as they had only been on a handful of dates. When she asked him to leave her flat, he refused and was adamant that he stayed. After a lengthy back and forth, she was able to persuade him to walk to the train station, but he then refused to board any train. Claire had had enough. She told him it was over, but he would not take no for an answer. Pesh called her 20 times, and when she didn't answer, he sat outside her flat for 2 hours. He became verbally abusive and shouted at her flatmate, and he was adamant that he needed to talk to Claire, but her flatmate refused, and he finally gave up and left. The following day, he followed her home with a huge bouquet of flowers. She reiterated what she had said the day before. It was over and she wasn't interested. She left the flowers on her doorstep, and they stayed there all week. This was just the beginning of a terrifying campaign of harassment. His incessant phone calls and texts carried on, with him messaging her up to 50 times a day. One text read, "We are meant to be together." She would change her phone number, but he would soon find out what her new one was, and the messages started all over again. His delusion that they were still in some sort of relationship was evident from his messages, with one reading, "It's our anniversary tomorrow. How should we spend it?" He would watch her while she was working and would use the mirrors and reflections in the store in order to look at her. He would apply pressure on people who worked at Harvey Nichols and ask them to get Claire to talk to him. On one occasion, she did decide to speak to him and asked him to stop harassing her. But this, like everything else she had previously said to him, had no impact. He would not take no for an answer. One day, as Claire was leaving work, he followed her in his security uniform. He grabbed her and shouted at her, yelling that he loved her and he knew that she loved him too. Claire tried her best to reason with him and said that she didn't love him. His response was to scream at her, "Yes, you do, you stupid little girl." His text messages would also become increasingly sinister, with one message reading, "If I can't have you, then no one will." This would go on for months, and the people in Claire's life were becoming increasingly aware of what he was doing. A colleague would say it was well known he was stalking her. His stalking was also having a major impact on her professional life. She was getting into trouble at work because she would run late or struggle to concentrate and focus. In March 2005, Claire was heading home. She noticed Pesh waiting at the underground station. In a desperate attempt to get away, she ran and jumped onto the train, but he was able to get onto the same carriage and sat opposite her. As the train came into the next stop, she got off and tried to run away, but he chased her and forcefully pushed her. She was then able to get onto another train, but Pesh was right behind her. She said, "If you don't leave me alone, I will have to report you." He replied, "If you report me, I will kill you." She said that all she wanted was for him to leave her alone, and if he did this, she wouldn't take it to the police. He smiled at her, stroked her face, and attempted to kiss her. Claire pushed him away, and he got off at the next train stop. When the train didn't immediately leave, he started banging on the train window and waving at Claire. Shaken and afraid, she called her mother in tears and told her what had happened. This was incredibly difficult for her family to see someone they loved being put through something like this. Claire's cousin would later say, "Just by looking at him, I didn't get a good feeling. He is batshit crazy, and he is dangerous, and he is unstable, and he's obsessed." Refusing to put up with it anymore, she told her bosses at work about what had been happening to her. The head of security for Harvey Nichols was a former police officer, and when he was informed, he took what Claire was saying seriously. He used the security cameras to track what Pesh was doing, and he soon saw him stalking and harassing her. He also spoke to different members of staff and compiled a file of complaints and accounts about what he had been doing. Pesh was moved on to a different floor and put on a different rotor to her, but this still made no difference, and he would come to Claire's department constantly. He was then suspended. The head of security encouraged her to report him to the police, as Pesh had threatened to kill her if she went to the authorities. She initially didn't want to report him. Her mother said she had also been hesitant as she felt embarrassed about what was happening to her. The tipping point came when it emerged that he had asked another member of staff, who was working part-time at the store whilst training to be a lawyer, if someone committed a murder, what would the sentence be? Claire then contacted the police. He was asked to come into work, where he was met by police and arrested. He was also immediately sacked from his job as a security guard. As he was let out, Claire saw him and told her mother that he looked angry. In spite of all that she had suffered, Claire felt bad, with her mother saying she didn't want him to get into trouble. She just wanted him to stop. He was taken to the station and interviewed, and his version of events was totally different to Claire's. He said that he had been the one to end the relationship, and that she had said that she loved him. He said he had then regretted breaking up with her, so went back, but he couldn't understand why she didn't want to be with him anymore. He said that he was sorry if he had upset her, but denied making threats to kill her. He admitted to everything else, saying he had only wanted to see if she wished to continue the relationship. The police took statements from Claire, but didn't take statements from her colleagues or flatmates who had witnessed the stalking. She also wasn't given a formal risk assessment. Other than what she had said, the officers had no evidence of him making threats to kill. Michael Pesh would later be released on bail under a non-molestation order, meaning he was not allowed to contact Claire at all or go to the store. His recent brush with the law had not deterred him, as just 2 days later, he was back on her doorstep, waving at her through the window. She called the police, but he had fled by the time they arrived. No action was taken. Claire and her flatmates decided to move away in the hope they could escape him, but within just a few days, on April 10th, he had turned up at their new place. After finding out where they were now living, she called the police again. They arrived, but like last time, Pesh was gone. Claire got into the police car and drove around trying to spot him, and eventually they did. He cooperated, even holding out his wrists for the officers to put handcuffs on him. He didn't seem bothered and was just smiling at Claire. He was put under arrest for breaching the conditions of his bail. He was charged under Section 2 of the Protection from Harassment Act of 1997. Claire's mother, Tricia, said, "The police relayed the message to Claire that he really didn't mean the threat, that he said there was a language barrier, and he was upset and would never have hurt her." He was sent to Bell Marsh Prison where he spent the next 8 days. He was then bailed to make his appearance in court, which was scheduled for the August 31st, on the condition he did not go to Knightsbridge or contact her in any way. As he awaited trial, Claire and her mother went on holiday to Florence to celebrate her birthday. They spent 5 days there, and Claire was making the most of every moment. Her mother said the trip was pure gold. After all she had been through, Claire was finally able to relax and enjoy herself. During this time, Michael Pesch went back to Slovakia. Whilst there, he went to a firing range and underwent weapons training. On June 14th, he passed the firearms exam, and a month later, he obtained a firearms license. He also purchased and registered a handgun. On July 20th, he headed back to the United Kingdom. He traveled via coach and ferry and was able to smuggle the handgun into the country in his luggage. As the trial loomed, Claire waited to be called to give evidence. But then, on the August 31st at Tower Bridge Magistrates Court, Michael Pesch suddenly changed his plea to guilty. There would be no trial, and Claire would not have to face him. He was then released on bail. Claire was relieved that what had been happening to her and what she had suffered was finally out, saying she now just wanted to get on with her life. September 13th, 2005. Since the trial, Claire had not seen Michael Pesch, and her life seemed to be getting back to normal. As Claire's day started, she headed into work. The hours ticked by as she served customers on the shop floor. And before long, she was just 10 minutes away from her shift ending at 8 p.m. A few customers were walking around, and the store was generally quiet as it was so close to closing time. One of Claire's colleagues put her hand up to Claire and looked at her watch, showing there was only a few minutes to go. Claire smiled back at her. One of Claire's colleagues then noticed a shadow appear behind her, and believed it may have been a boyfriend who had come to meet her as she finished. The figure then raised his arm, brandishing a gun. He fired a shot at the back of Claire's head, and she fell to the floor. He then fired 3 times at her face. As people ran to find cover, he fired another shot into the ceiling. He then turned the gun on himself and took his own life. Michael Pesch had just carried out his terrifying threat. Claire's mother, Tricia, had been out celebrating a friend's birthday that night. After returning home around midnight, she heard a loud banging on her front door. After opening it, she was met by 2 police officers. One of them told her they were there about her daughter. The family liaison officer then gave her the devastating news. Her daughter had been shot dead at work. Tricia knew instantly who was responsible and said, "It was Pecci, wasn't it?" The officer nodded, confirming that it was. In a statement, her mother said, Claire was unaware of her own beauty, both inside and outside, and the only fault Claire possessed was to see good in everybody. This trust was eventually abused, leaving us all with such unbearable grief. Her colleagues were left devastated by her murder, and they were offered counseling to help them process their trauma. As the investigations into what had happened were carried out, Pesch's flatmate found a 40-page notebook. One entry shortly before he murdered Claire detailed how he was contemplating the meaning of life, with references being made to ghosts and prophets. Also in the diary was Claire's address. He had written poetry too, and one of the poems read as follows: "From our love all that is left is a dried up spring, yet all we had to do was push away the stone that was blocking it. I have as many memories of you as there are in a forest trees. You are my only love, so ring me, please." It was revealed that he had gained entry to Harvey Nichols by sneaking through a back door, despite having been told to stay away. He had also taken cocaine. When it emerged that Pecci had been arrested and bailed, domestic violence campaigners wanted answers as to why this was allowed to happen. The head of the charity Refuge said, "Yet again, women who are stalked and threatened by their partners have been let down by the criminal justice system. How many more murders do we have to have before women get the protection they need and deserve?" A few weeks later, Claire's funeral was held in Tunbridge Wells, with 100 turning out to pay their respects and remember her. An inquest into Claire's death was held. The Westminster coroner, Dr. Paul Natman, said that after hearing about the alleged errors by police, courts, and prosecutors, he would consider widening the inquest. The inquest heard that a risk assessment had not been done by the officers who had first interviewed Claire, and that she had not been told that he had been charged and remanded in custody. It was also revealed that a form had not been filled out, which helps police establish a level of threat that someone might pose. But it was also discussed that even if the form had been filled out, as Michael Pesch had no previous convictions, he likely still would have been determined to be low risk. In 2007, the coroner ruled that the murder of Claire Bernal could not have been reasonably foreseen, but he did criticize the police for wasting time with filling out forms to provide a scapegoat. Claire's mother Tricia was determined her daughter's death was not going to be in vain, and she channeled her efforts into changing the law and making stalking a criminal offense in itself. She worked with other families who had also been affected by stalking, teaming up with Carol Farrakay and Stella Moore. Carol's daughter had been stabbed to death after being stalked, and Stella's daughter had been shot also after being stalked. The three supported a pioneering new project, the first of its kind in Europe, called the Family Justice Center. All domestic violence or stalking victims who use the service are immediately classed as high risk before a fuller assessment can be made. The Family Justice Center works with various agencies and charities, including police and investigators, to help put victims in touch with the right people, to ensure that they have the correct support. Tricia, Stella, and Carol were also there in January of 2008, when the Family Justice Center was visited by the Home Affairs Select Committee. Together, they also helped set up protection against stalking, which amongst the many aspects of its work, runs a helpline to support people impacted by stalking. Tricia said, "Every county should have a stalking service. We need to protect victims, but we also need to address the offender. This is crucial. Unless you have a two-pronged approach, it won't work. They go into prison, and when they come out, it is likely they will either pursue the victim or move on to another. Simply locking them up is not going to work. It wouldn't have worked for my daughter's killer." Finally, their hard work paid off, and in 2012, new legislation was passed that made stalking a criminal offense. In 2021, Tricia was awarded an MBE for her campaigning work, and she remains an incredible victims advocate. Tricia said, "The strongest message I can give any victim is go to the police. Nobody has the right to control someone else's life." Claire Bernal was a young woman cut down in the prime of her life. The impact of her death has been momentous and has led to much-needed changes in the law. It is through this tireless victims advocacy that Claire's memory will continue to live on. March 30th, 1980, became a somber date in Lake Erie's history. That morning, Sandusky police responded to a report of a strange object floating near the lake's edge. Approaching Cedar Point, officers quickly grasped the seriousness of the situation. They called for backup and cordoned off the area to keep onlookers away. Unfortunately, details surrounding the discovery were scarce. According to the Detroit Free Press, police found the body of a young woman estimated to be between 20 and 30 years old. She was about 5 feet 5 inches and weighed approximately 120 pounds, wearing what was described as a disco-style dress. Her body slumped along the edge of Lake Erie. The news sent shockwaves through the community, and investigators immediately focused on identifying the victim. Yet, this crucial step in the case would remain unresolved. The Sandusky police did not disclose the woman's cause of death, which became a subject of speculation. The autopsy revealed that she had multiple fractures, including her femur, pelvis, and jaw, though it wasn't clear whether these injuries occurred before or after death. Press releases and conferences were held, but no one came forward to identify the young woman in the size 12 disco dress. The case immediately went stale. There were no scars, jewelry pieces, or other identifying features on her body. In time, the woman was buried as the Erie County Jane Doe. There was no date of birth to adorn her grave, just March 30th, 1980. The Sandusky Police Department never gave up on the Erie County Jane Doe, but with limited evidence and resources, the case could not progress. It would take decades for the name Erie County Jane Doe to appear in the media again, but there was good news this time. In late 2021, the Porchlight Project, a non-profit organization that helps to fund the solving of cold cases, announced they would be willing to pay for the new DNA testing in the Erie County Jane Doe case. By 2021, genetic genealogy was beginning to peak, and the Sandusky Police Department believed this may be their only chance to close this case once and for all. Shortly after accepting the donation, the woman's remains were sent to Bode Technology in Virginia for further DNA analysis. Unfortunately, this kind of testing isn't instantaneous. Technicians worked exceedingly hard to research, repair, and test samples for years. Almost 2 years later, in March 2023, Sandusky Police Department and the Porchlight Project announced that the Erie County Jane Doe had been identified as 31-year-old Patricia Eleanor Greenwood. The announcement came on March 30th, 43 years to the day since she was discovered. Analysis found Patricia after discovering that she was one of 12 children who had been given up for adoption. Patricia was born in 1948 in Michigan and has lived in Traverse City, Bay City, and Saginaw. Patricia was never reported missing, and her siblings last saw her in 1979. The Sandusky Police Department is still working on Patricia's cold case, and while she has been identified, it's anything but closed. According to Patricia's sister, she may have been a sex worker at the time of her death, and the Sandusky Police Department believed that Patricia met with foul play. Unfortunately, no one in her family had a photograph of Patricia, and law enforcement is hoping to find anyone who knew her to come forward, as they'd like to get a better picture of what her life was like. Hopefully, with that information, they can be one step closer to finding her killer. Nick Edwards, a board member for Project Porchlight, gave this statement to the media regarding Patricia's case. Quote, "Being able to give Patricia Greenwood her name back is the first step in finding the justice that she deserves. Thank you to the brilliant folks at Bode for the wonderful work that they do." Bode continues to impress, and their assistance to those in law enforcement is making it more difficult for bad people to get away with bad things. The Sandusky Police Department never gave up on this victim even after all these years. Now it's time for the public to come together and provide information about Patricia Greenwood to the detectives. Patricia needs your help. The investigation into Patricia's murder continues, and if you have any information, you're asked to contact the Sandusky Police Department at 41962759080. It was on February 16, 1986, when hikers along the Pacific Crest Trail made a grisly discovery at the Los Coyotes Indian Reservation. The partially decomposed body of a woman lay at the edge of the campsite. San Diego County Sheriff's Office was immediately dispatched to the scene and began their investigation. Moments later, the San Diego County Sheriff's Office received a call that would change everything. 14 miles from where the female victim was, there was found a man in a similar condition. Both victims were wearing thick jackets and layers of clothing. The similarities were too apparent to ignore, and investigators knew they had to identify both bodies before their killer could be identified. Law enforcement has withheld a lot of information in both of these cases. The manner of death of the man found 14 miles away has never been released to preserve the investigation's integrity. Detectives struggled to make any headway in either case. There was very little evidence, and the evidence the SDCSO did have was being withheld from the media. Her murder floated through the media for a few weeks before interest fizzled out. For decades, her case would go untouched, but the San Diego County Sheriff's Office knew there was family out there looking for their loved one. In 2023, the San Diego County Sheriff's Office turned to genetic genealogy. A sample of the woman's hair was submitted for analysis on websites such as 23andMe and GeneMatch. According to CBS, quote, "Using this DNA analysis as well as census records and other public information, detectives were able to build family trees and track down relatives." Investigators have now identified the family tree, and all they had to do was find the missing link. Shortly after her DNA was submitted, law enforcement identified the Jane Doe as Claudet Jean Zabulski Powers. The mother of two would have been 24 years old when she was brutally murdered. Detectives pieced together what they knew of her life before she disappeared. In the early 1980s, Claudet left her Michigan home and moved to Washington with her husband. By 1983, Claudet filed for divorce and found a property in San Diego County for herself and her daughters. However, in 1984, tragedy struck the Powers family when their patriarch passed away. Upon losing her father, Claudet felt lost. Her siblings were called to officers that September 1984 was the last time they saw or spoke to their beloved sister at their father's funeral. After that, she dropped off the map. Claudet's family said that they never gave up looking for her. Her siblings hired a private investigator, but there is no sign. Her siblings and family loved Claudet, and they knew her disappearance was out of the ordinary. However, she was never reported missing formally, and her family had no idea that she'd been deceased all these years. Whilst Claudet has now been identified, investigators still have a long way to go in this investigation. They are now tasked with piecing Claudet's life together from September 1984 to 1986. There are some reports that she worked as a waitress in Escondido, and anyone with information or may have known Claudet is asked to come forward. Her sister said in a statement to the media, quote, "It's been really hard on our family. Someone knows what happened. A neighbor, anyone that knew her knows what happened. If you're still alive and you knew my sister and you knew what happened to her, please come forward. Please, we need closure." San Diego County Sheriff's Office has not released the manners of the death for Claudet or the Jane Doe, and the investigation is ongoing. What they have said is that they are looking for a male suspect and that Claudet had suffered a violent death. They're hoping to identify the man who had been murdered as well. They said that the man is a similar age to Claudet, mid-20s, and that they were both similarly dressed in thermals and clothing suitable for camping. They had both been deceased for approximately 2 weeks before their bodies were discovered. No other personal effects were found and no camping gear, bags, or purses. The area was remote, and they would have needed a vehicle to get there. At this time, there are no sketches of Jane Doe available nor much information that might help identify him. On October 26, 1976, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department were called to the Talisman Sugar Farm in Palm Beach County, Florida. This case would be like no other, sending investigators on an ever-twisting turning path. In the cane field lay the body of a man who was later believed to be white or Native American. His remains were somewhat skeletonized and that he had been exposed to the elements for at least 2 months before his discovery. Forensic experts deemed his death a homicide with a gunshot wound to the back of his skull as the cause of death. He had a unique Timex watch with the initials LJ carved on the inside. Investigators also discovered that Palm Beach County Jane Doe had been shot 3 times overall. Over the years, several forensic photography experts have created several renditions of what he may have looked like in life, but these failed to produce any leads. In 2022, Othram, the nonprofit organization, joined forces with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. Their press release from Othram states, quote, "This case was entered into NAMUS as UP 1300. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office sent skeletal remains for the unidentified homicide victim to Othram. After many months of hard work, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office announced that the 1976 Palm Beach Jane Doe has been identified as 29-year-old Douglas Lindstreeter. In April 1976, Douglas and a group of friends traveled from his hometown of Bryan, Ohio to Florida on a boys' trip in March 1976. According to Douglas's friends, he was last seen in the vicinity of the Spanish Oaks Apartments in Boca Raton, Florida in April 1976. He went by the nickname Strut. From Florida, it seems he became separated from his friends and disappeared. His friends returned home without him. His estimated time of death was around August, but he disappeared in April. No one knows what he'd been doing in the months between his disappearance and murder. Anyone with information is asked to contact Detective John Cogburn of the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office at 56168840063. There's a $3,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest. Fire Island lies just to the west of Anchorage, Alaska, near the head of Cook Inlet. On July 24, 1989, human remains were discovered on the island's northwest shore. They had undergone a great deal of decomposition, meaning that only a limited amount of information about the person whose remains they were could be determined during the autopsy. The remains were believed to be those of a Caucasian male between 35–50 years old. An anthropologist was brought into the case and determined that the remains had been on the beach where they were found for at least a year. However, an exact time frame of the Jane Doe's death could not be determined. Alaska State Troopers found evidence on the remains that indicated that Jane Doe's death was of a criminal nature, although details about that evidence have not been released to the public. Alaska State Troopers exhausted all means of identifying the remains available to them at the time but could not make an identification. The remains were eventually buried at Anchorage Municipal Cemetery. In 2003, the Alaska State Troopers enlisted the assistance of the FBI, submitting hair and tissue samples taken from the remains during the autopsy in 1989 and kept by the State Medical Examiner's Office. The FBI laboratory was able to extract mitochondrial DNA from the samples. The profile was entered into a missing persons database, but no matches were found. In 2021, the case was formally reopened by the Alaska Bureau of Investigation Cold Case Investigation Unit. The State Medical Examiner's Office had kept bone samples from Jane Doe's remains. These samples were then sent to Othram Inc., a private forensics laboratory in Texas. Scientists there were able to extract DNA from the bone samples. They then used forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive DNA profile. This profile was used to conduct genealogical research. Several individuals, all linked to the same man by DNA, were identified. Some of these individuals also had ties to Alaska. Further investigation led authorities to believe that this man could be their Jane Doe. A DNA sample was then taken from a closed blood relative of this individual. The analysis of their DNA and its comparison to the DNA from the remains confirmed the match. On December 1, 2021, it was announced that the Jane Doe found on Fire Island in 1989 had been identified as Michael Allison Beavers. Michael was a heavy machine operator who lived in Chugiak, Alaska, and operated an excavation business there. He was last seen alive at the age of 40 in late November of 1979, when he left home to drive to Seattle to meet with a business associate. He never arrived. His wife reported him missing 2 months later. Little progress was ever made in the investigation into Michael's disappearance, and it was closed in 1982. Michael was declared legally dead 10 years later. The investigation into Michael's disappearance and murder is ongoing. On Sunday, October 5, 1980, two brothers were driving near the Arroyo Grande Wash, south of State Route 146 in Henderson, Nevada. Around 9:20 p.m., in a remote desert area, they discovered the nude body of a young woman lying along the roadside. An autopsy revealed that she had died from blunt force trauma to the back of her head, likely caused by a roofing or framing hammer. She also sustained severe facial injuries and puncture wounds to her upper back. The Clark County Coroner's Office ruled her death a homicide. Authorities believed she hadn't been in the desert long, as she was easily visible when found, and it didn't appear her killer had tried to conceal her body. The coroner estimated she had been killed within 24 hours of her discovery. Her body had been washed, and part of a shower curtain was found nearby, suggesting an attempt to clean her before she was left at the scene. The young woman was approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed around 100 pounds. Her age was estimated to be between 14 and 19 years old. She had shoulder-length, reddish hair. She had a small birthmark on her lower back and a homemade tattoo of the letter S on the inside of her right forearm. These details did not lead to the identification of the young woman. She was referred to by police as Jane Arroyo Grande Doe, as they continued to investigate her murder. They took her fingerprints but found no matches, as well as x-rays they hoped could also help identify her. Despite their efforts, both her identity and the identity of her killer remained unknown for decades. John Williams was the homicide detective on call the weekend the young woman was found, and began working on her case that evening, ultimately becoming the case's lead investigator. He continued working on the case in an official capacity until he retired in 2006, and unofficially after his retirement. He was one of several members of the police department who contributed money to give Jane Arroyo Grande Doe a proper burial and buy her a headstone. He and his wife visited her grave and brought her flowers every year. "I'll never not work on it. We're basically the only family she's got," Williams said in 2006, in a news article written in honor of his retirement. Jane Arroyo Grande Doe was exhumed 4 times, in 2002, 2003, 2009, and 2016, to collect more evidence for further forensic testing. More than 30 missing women were considered as potential identities of Jane Arroyo Grande Doe over the years, but they were all eliminated. The case was formally reopened in 2015 in honor of the 35th anniversary of the John Williams went with Detective Joseph Ebert, the currently detective on the case, when he visited the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children about the case. Nick Mack released a new artistic representation of Jane Arroyo Grande Doe, and artist Carl Koppelman released another rendering of her in 2018. With dental records, fingerprints, and conventional DNA searches failing to identify Jane Arroyo Grande Doe, police in Henderson turned to genetic genealogy. Luckily, one of her relatives in California had taken a commercial DNA test and showed up as a partial match to her DNA in a genealogical database. This relative put authorities in touch with the man ultimately determined to be Jane Arroyo Grande Doe's grandfather in Arkansas. He told investigators that their victim had sisters. 2 of these sisters provided DNA samples, which ultimately confirmed Jane Arroyo Grande Doe's identity. At a press conference on December 2, 2021, 41 years after Jane Arroyo Grande Doe's body was found, the City of Henderson Police Department's investigative division announced that she had finally been identified as 17-year-old Tammy Terrell of Artesia, New Mexico. Tammy was born on July 4, 1963. She was one of 4 sisters who were raised in a foster home. In September of 1980, she was staying at a Surin's home, a youth group home in Roswell, New Mexico, trying to get her life in order. On September 28th, she and another girl living at the facility were dropped off by a staff member at the New Mexico Fairgrounds, where the Roswell State Fair was being held. When the staff member returned to pick up the girls, Tracy was not there. Tracy was seen later that evening at a Denny's in Roswell with 2 adults, a white man and a white woman. Police believe they may have been planning to leave New Mexico and travel to an unknown location in California. According to Tracy's youngest sister Carla, police were not interested in investigating Tracy's disappearance when she first vanished because she had run away before and would be turning 18 in less than a year. Tracy's family did not give up on looking for her, however, looking at the faces of homeless people and people in crowds wherever they went. For the next 4 decades, hoping to one day see Tracy's face. Carla plans on visiting Nevada in January of 2022 to visit her sister's grave and meet with the investigators who remain so committed to Tracy's case. Despite recently being hospitalized, John Williams was present at the press conference announcing Tracy's identification. The investigation into Tracy's murder remains open. Lauren Stewart, a 45-year-old wife and mother, appeared to have it all. She was married to her supportive husband, Dan, and was a devoted mother to her adult children, Stephen and Bethany. On the surface, her life seemed flawless, but behind the scenes, it was far from perfect. Just weeks before a shocking event, Lauren was secretly searching YouTube for ways to end her life and learning how to use a Glock handgun. Join us as we delve into the complex and haunting story of Lauren Stewart. Lauren Devine Stewart was born on January 9, 1973. She spent most of her life in Michigan and worked part-time as a personal trainer at the YMCA in Farmington Hills and occasionally as a house cleaner. After leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses, she pursued modeling and acting, exploring her creative side through workshops and networking with photographers. She was known as a charming woman. According to one of her online profiles, she expressed her passion for acting and modeling, describing herself as adventurous and open to various experiences. Lauren was married to Daniel Stewart, who worked at the University of Michigan as a lead software architect, focusing on developing technology to predict heart attacks. Dan worked as a coder in the technology industry for many years. He and his wife were devout Christians within the Jehovah's Witness denomination for an extended period until 2013, when they decided to explore a different approach to their spiritual life. The couple had 2 accomplished children, 27-year-old Stephen, a data solution architect, and 24-year-old Bethany, a talented artist and graphic designer. Like his father, Stephen shared a passion for technology, while Bethany showcased her talents in art and graphic design. At 45, Lauren Stewart seemed to have it all. A flourishing husband, 2 college-educated children, a budding modeling career, and a charming Kego Harbor home with a welcoming heart wreath on the door. But behind this facade of perfection lurked a hidden pain. Lauren grappled with the heartache of exclusion and rejection from the religion she and Daniel were born into. Just a few years back, Lauren and her husband chose to break away from the Jehovah's Witness faith, known for its strict indoctrination and practice of shunning former members. The idyllic exterior masked a complex web of emotions and choices that would soon unravel into a gripping narrative. Lauren and her family had been devout Jehovah's Witnesses, strictly adhering to beliefs that shunned celebrations like birthdays, Easter, Christmas, and any event they believed went against the teachings of Christ. The faith strongly discouraged higher education, putting Stephen and Bethany at risk of excommunication if they pursued college. Dan envisioned a brighter future for their children through higher education. When they sought approval from church elders, the response was resolute: disobey the church's policies and face disfellowship. This threat weighed heavily on the stewards, as nearly everyone they knew, including extended family, was part of the congregation. After careful consideration, the stewards made a bold decision to leave the religion they had long embraced. Although it initially felt right, the community's disapproval became unbearable, especially for Lauren. Simple tasks like grocery shopping were marred by dirty looks and hurtful comments from once-believed friends made intentionally within earshot. Residing in a small community with many Jehovah's Witnesses, the stewards grappled with the reality of their outcast status, being consistently reminded whenever possible. This emotional burden took its toll, leading to a breaking point. In search of a lifeline, Lauren turned to the gym, making it a regular part of her life to rebuild her physical well-being. Her transformation was so remarkable that she secured a job as a fitness instructor, leveraging her natural beauty to become a model with surprising success. Lauren appeared pleasant, exuding optimism despite her church's rejection, but beneath her facade of confidence lay profound and unimaginable suffering. Lauren battled chronic depression even before the shunning, which intensified with each passing day. Desperately masking her inner turmoil, she would occasionally reveal cracks in her facade, quickly concealing them with a fake smile. One of Lauren's most guarded secrets was the family's crippling debt, pushing them to the edge of ruin. Faced with a dual onslaught of financial and emotional distress, she devised a plan to resolve all her problems at once. Lauren Stewart's descent into darkness was chilling and heartbreaking. She delved into grim research, scouring YouTube for methods of ending her own life and instructional videos on handling a handgun, all leading up to a fateful day. On February 15, 2018, she left a poignant note on the dinner table, meticulously tidied the home, and texted her loved ones, as well as her husband's boss. Just before the unthinkable act, she turned over all the family photos on a secretary's desk. At 9:24 a.m., she sent a message to her husband's boss that said, "Mark, this is Lauren. Dan had an accident this morning and died. I can't talk now. Someone will inform you later of the details at the hospital." The boss reached out for further details, but got no response. Hours later at 5:07 p.m. on the same day, she reached out to her cousin confessing she had become evil. She said, "I took my husband and kids with me so they don't have to feel my selfish act. They will sleep until Christ resurrects them. I truly hope you do better where I failed." Her cousin responded, "Lauren, you are scaring me. What are you saying? Don't do it, Lauren." Lauren had become more and more detached from reality in recent months. Unbeknownst to her family, she had a pistol in her possession and tragically decided to turn it against the very people she professed to love, one by one. This heartbreaking culmination of her internal torment resulted in a devastating series of acts. Her first victim was her husband, 47-year-old Dan, who, unsuspectingly, relaxed in their furnished basement. Lauren, armed and determined, used a throw pillow as a makeshift silencer and shot him in the head as he attempted to flee. With her most significant threat eliminated, she ascended the stairs. Upstairs, her 24-year-old daughter Bethany, who had recently celebrated her birthday, lay asleep in her room. Without hesitation, Lauren positioned herself just feet from the bed, aimed the gun, and ended her daughter's life in an instant. Next, her son Stephen, who had his place across town, unknowingly arrived at the family home, lured by pretenses. Oblivious to the imminent danger, he busied himself with the task his mother had prepared. With his back turned, unaware of what was coming, Lauren, the mother he loved, shot him at point-blank range. The horrifying scene didn't end there. Lauren took the life of the family dog, placing its body in the bathtub. A neighbor heard the shots, but assumed someone was slamming doors. As the house became a chilling temporary morgue, she meticulously tidied up. The darkness culminated as Lauren turned the gun on herself, using a method she had researched online. The cousin Lauren had tried texting her back, but Lauren never responded. The cousin went to Lauren's house the following morning, February 16th, with a friend. With no response at the door, they contacted the police for a welfare check. When police arrived at the house on the morning of February 16th, the kitchen was organized, the refrigerator was stocked, various items had handwritten labels, and a calendar was hung on the refrigerator. Their discovery began with the family dog in the bathtub, triggering a chilling response from the officers, who feared there was an active shooter. "Get your gun out, there's a dead dog in the tub," one had yelled to a partner. Climbing a spiral staircase to the second floor, they found Stephen Stewart on the floor, believed to have been shot while seated on a chair. In another room, Bethany lay lifeless, shot in her sleep with a pillow muffling the sound. Gunshots were also noticeable on the pillowcase. Dan Stewart was discovered on the basement floor in front of a couch, his right hand still in his jeans pocket. The slightly pulled white pocket liner on his left pocket suggested he was standing when he was shot and attempted to react, thus pulling the pocket liner. Upstairs, Lauren was discovered at the base of the stairs, a pistol by her side, her self-inflicted wound between the eyes echoing her online research. 2 notes were found on the dinner table. One was for the medical examiner, while the other, a chilling suicide note, exposed Lauren's inner turmoil. "I allowed evil into my heart when I chose not to accept God's free love, and it made me sick inside," Lauren wrote. "I killed my family because I know my death would stumble them. At least now they will not suffer and will be resurrected to life forever in peace." As the police delved into the Steward's world, a complex and perplexing picture began to emerge. Interviews with family members, friends, and neighbors painted the couple as reclusive, marked by a sense of estrangement after leaving the Jehovah's Witness church. Her struggles marred Lauren's history. Some family members said Lauren, who had 11 siblings, suffered from depression compounded by the weight of motherhood. In recent years, she spiraled into religious fixation, often launching impassioned tirades. Her family members, including her father and sister, revealed the extent of the emotional distance that had grown over time and had not spoken to her in years. Her mother passed away when she was just 13 years old. For years, Lauren had been estranged from her family, who saw her relationship with Dan as a force pulling her away from them. This friction was exacerbated by the couple's mutual struggles with mental health, painting a picture of a relationship entwined with pain and distress. To those who knew Lauren, her decision to leave the Jehovah's Witness faith marked her as an apostate. This bold choice not only isolated her from her community, but also caused significant upheaval in her life. Joyce Taylor, a longtime family friend who was intimately acquainted with the family, was visibly shaken. She believed that the murders were a direct consequence of the Stewarts' rejection by the Jehovah's Witnesses. Taylor and other former members illuminated the harsh reality of leaving the faith. They explained that once you depart from the church, even your own family members who remain are forbidden from interacting with you. This severe form of shunning takes a heavy emotional toll. According to Taylor, Lauren and Daniel's desire to provide their children with a college education directly conflicted with the religion's teachings, which frowned upon such pursuits. The collision between their aspirations and the rigid doctrines of their faith set the stage for a tragic unraveling. They were shunned everywhere and every way possible. If Lauren went to the grocery store, They didn't look her in the eye, Taylor said. When you're raised a Jehovah's Witness, they choose your friends, they choose who you associate with, and if you go against that, they will disfellowship you or shun you. In the shocking turn of events, Joyce Taylor stormed into a Kingdom Hall meeting in Union Lake, seizing the moment to confront the congregation. Standing on a chair, she boldly criticized the gathering, her voice resonating with a mix of anger and sorrow. "Excuse me, everyone," she declared. "My name is Joyce Taylor. 2 days ago, 4 people died as a result of your shunning process." Taylor's outburst sent shock waves through the room as she pushed away congregants and vented her pent-up frustration. 5 years ago, you people pulled your support from this small family. The only support they had was you. You turned them away and you shunned them. And for what? She exclaimed. Because they wanted to raise their children as they saw fit. The police were aware of the family's issues with their former church. Police records detailed how, on February 6th, at 11:05 p.m., Lauren recorded a poignant 2-minute video explaining the depths of her despair. She cited a multitude of issues, expressing her inability to carry on and her desire not to burden others any longer. Abandoned by her church family, Lauren found herself drowning in a relentless sea of despair, with what she believed to be the only escape, death. Convinced that ending her own life was the solution to her unbearable suffering, she made the agonizing choice to also take the lives of her loved ones, sparing them what she perceived as the inevitable shame and suffering that her actions would bring upon their household. Police records painted a grim picture of Lauren's mental state in the lead-up to the tragedy, noting her unmistakable signs of severe depression and increasingly abnormal behavior. It appeared that she had immersed herself in a personal interpretation of religion, intensifying her depression. Shockingly, she never sought professional help or counseling, and no prescription drugs or alcohol were found in her system. However, traces of marijuana were discovered, not just in Lauren's system, but also in her husband and sons. The police investigation unraveled a complex web of factors contributing to her devastating actions. Loneliness, the severed ties with family and friends over religious differences, and deep-seated emotional scars stemming from alleged childhood sexual abuse, all converged to amplify her anguish, ultimately driving her to commit the unthinkable. In a striking testament to the estrangement within the family, Lauren's sister's response spoke volumes. She exhibited a somber demeanor and expressed a surprising lack of surprise when hearing the news of her sister's actions, demonstrating just how far Lauren had drifted from her own sister, who even showed little regret about the tragedy. The motives behind Lauren Stewart's tragic actions may have stemmed from the deep isolation imposed by her former church and the unresolved trauma from her childhood. It raises the question, could things have turned out differently if she had reached out for help when she felt overwhelmed by her circumstances? Sadly, instead of seeking counseling or professional support, Lauren chose a path of self-destruction, with devastating consequences for everyone involved. As we reflect on this heartbreaking story, our thoughts are with the victims whose lives were senselessly cut short and the loved ones they left behind. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.